Okay, so today we're going to be looking at some ancient guidelines,
Mm.
and it's going to be pretty fascinating. We're going back to the book of Leviticus,
Right.
and we're going to be examining some of the ideas in there about
Okay.
ethical behavior and honesty,
Mm-hmm.
and also how they addressed making things right
Yeah.
when somebody had done wrong.
Like restitution.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and also some of their rituals of devotion.
Right.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the instructions for restitution for wrongdoing,
Right.
and the procedures for different types of offerings that they made,
Mhm.
burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sin offering.
Yeah, that's right.
So you might be thinking, okay, ancient rituals.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with us today?
Okay.
And it's a fair question.
It is,
Some of these practices are definitely from a different time and place.
of course.
But we're going to try to look beyond just the specific actions and
Uh-huh.
see if we can understand some of the core principles about their values
Mm-hmm.
and how they live their lives.
Yeah, and see what echoes
Mm,
of these ideas still make sense now.
absolutely. And maybe we can find some things that,
Yeah.
that still resonate with us.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's start by talking about sin
Okay.
and restitution.
Yeah, so making things right.
The text begins by talking about unfaithfulness to the Lord.
Right.
And it grounds this idea
Yeah.
immediately in everyday human interactions.
Okay.
Specifically when somebody deceives their neighbor.
Yeah.
And what I find really striking is how concrete the examples of wrongdoing are.
Yeah. It's not just like a general feeling of being bad. It's like they give you very specific.
Very specific
Yeah.
examples. It's like lying about something
Right.
that someone entrusted to you.
Right. Like if they gave you something for safekeeping.
Or something that they left in your care.
Yeah.
Or if you just straight up stole something. Right.
It also covers like cheating someone,
Uh-huh.
lying if you find something
Yeah.
that was lost.
The whole finders keepers?
Yeah, exactly. The whole finders keepers debate.
Yeah.
Or even if you swore falsely
Right.
about any of these things.
Yeah, about any of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a pretty thorough rundown of
Yeah.
how you can basically violate trust
Yes.
within a community.
Yeah.
And so the principle seems to be about upholding trust
Right.
and avoiding actual harm
Exactly.
to another person,
Right.
tangible harm.
Precisely.
And the text makes it clear that if you've done any of those things,
Yeah.
you know just feeling bad about it
Right.
isn't enough.
It's not enough.
There's a very specific requirement to give back what was taken.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually have to return the stolen item or
Yeah.
whatever you got through extortion,
That's
the
right.
thing that was entrusted to you,
Yeah.
or even that lost item that you conveniently found.
Right.
And and then also, if you lied under oath about it,
That's right.
that needs to be corrected.
You have to make it right.
Right.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just end with returning the original item.
No, it doesn't.
There's this element of recompense.
Right.
And this is where it gets really interesting because
Mhm.
you don't just give back what you took.
Right.
You have to return the full value plus add a fifth of the value on top of it.
Oh,
It really shows how seriously they took
right.
breaking that trust.
It really emphasizes the weight of
Yeah.
the offense.
And the timing is also important here
Yes. The timing is crucial.
because the text specifically says
Mm-hmm.
that you have to give this full restitution
Right.
plus the additional 20%
Right.
to the person you wronged
Yeah.
on the same day that you present your guilt offering.
That's right. It's all tied together.
So it's all tied together.
Yeah.
So what was this guilt offering?
Well, the guilt offering was a specific type of sacrifice.
Right.
The text says that you have to bring a ram
Okay.
from your flock
Okay.
that has no defects,
Right.
and that is of the proper value to
Right.
the priest,
Right.
which meant that it was presented before the Lord. It wasn't just any animal that they happened to have around.
Right.
You-
Right. So you have this very practical step of making these financial amends
Right.
and then this symbolic act
Yeah.
with the animal.
It's both.
What was the point of the guilt offering itself?
Well, the text is clear about that.
Okay.
The priest would use the offering to perform an act of atonement
Okay.
for the person before the Lord.
Okay.
And through this process, they would receive forgiveness
Okay.
for the things that they had done that caused guilt.
So you see this connection between addressing the harm and seeking reconciliation
Yeah, it wasn't enough to just say,
on a spiritual level.
I'm sorry to your neighbor.
Right. It wasn't enough to just apologize.
Yeah, address the spiritual aspect.
Right.
Yeah.
And make things right in that way too.
Yes, make things right in a tangible way
Yeah.
before seeking that spiritual reconciliation.
And I think that's something that we can definitely connect with today.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to say, I'm sorry and feel bad about it.
Right. You have to actually take some step to make it right.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on to a different kind of offering.
Okay.
The burnt offering.
All right.
What were the rules for that one?
So the burnt offering had its own very specific set of rules.
Okay.
And these were primarily for Aaron and his sons.
Right.
The priests.
Right.
The main idea behind the burnt offering is its continuous nature.
Okay, so it was to stay on the altar hearth all night long,
Okay.
right until morning.
Okay.
And most importantly, the fire on the altar
Yeah.
had to be kept burning constantly. It was this ongoing symbol.
Yeah, like a symbol of something that was
Yeah.
always there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the morning had its own set of procedures.
Okay.
So the priest had to put on specific linen clothing,
Okay.
including linen undergarments,
Okay.
to remove the ashes from the burnt offering.
Right.
And these ashes weren't just thrown away anywhere. They were
Right.
placed beside the altar first.
Okay, so almost like a temporary
Like a temporary holding
connecting
spot
spot.
before final
They
disposal.
were taken away.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the priest would change
Right.
out of those linen clothes,
Yeah.
put on his other garments
Okay.
to carry the ashes
Right.
outside the camp to a place that was designated
Uh-huh.
as ceremonially clean.
So there's a real attention to detail here about the ritual purity and how
Right.
these remnants were handled.
Yeah, were handled very specifically.
Right, and the fire itself.
Yes, the fire itself was really
It
important.
was really important.
The text emphasizes repeatedly
Right,
that the fire on the altar must be kept burning
right.
and must never go out. It's not just something you light and leave to die down.
Die down.
Yeah.
Had to be kept going.
It had to be kept going.
Yeah.
Every morning, the priest had a job of adding firewood,
Right.
arranging the burnt offering on the fire,
Okay.
and also burning the fat from other offerings,
Okay.
called fellowship offerings on it.
So there's this constant tending.
Constant tending, which seems to be very significant.
Yeah. What do you think that represents?
It could symbolize an unceasing devotion
Okay.
or this continuous connection with the divine.
Right. It's always there.
Yeah. And the text reiterates.
Okay.
At the end of this section, it says, the fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously.
Right.
They must not go out. So we have this constant burnt offering.
Next up, we have the grain offering.
Okay.
What were the specifics for that one?
So the grain offering also had its own set of regulations.
Okay.
And it was brought before the Lord in front of the altar
Okay.
by Aaron's sons.
All right.
And the priest had a specific role to play here.
Okay.
They would take a handful of the finest flour,
Okay.
some olive oil,
Right.
and all the incense that was part of the offering.
Okay.
This portion was then burned on the altar
Right.
as what the text calls a memorial portion.
Okay.
And it's described as an aroma
Okay.
that is pleasing to the Lord.
I like this.
Yeah, I like this one.
This is good.
Yeah, so a part of it went up in smoke as an offering.
What happened to the rest of the grain?
Well, the remainder of the grain offering
Okay.
was to be eaten by Aaron and his sons.
Oh, okay. So they got to eat some of it.
They got to eat some of it.
Yeah.
However, there were specific instructions about this as well.
Okay.
Okay, it had to be eaten without yeast.
No yeast.
No yeast.
Okay.
And in a designated holy area.
Right.
Specifically the courtyard of the tent of meeting.
So no leavened bread allowed.
No leavened bread.
That seems to be a theme.
It's a recurring theme in a lot of ancient food rituals.
Yeah.
And the text highlights that this grain offering was not to be baked with yeast
Right.
because it was considered their share
Okay.
of the food offerings presented to the Lord.
Yep.
And it was designated as most holy,
Okay.
just like the sin offering and the guilt offering.
So it's a sacred food source.
It's a sacred food source.
For priests.
Yeah, specifically for the priests.
Okay.
The text clarifies that any male descendant of Aaron could eat it.
Okay.
And this was to be a permanent right
Right.
for all their future generations.
It's like a family business.
Yeah, it's like a family business.
Yeah.
There's also an interesting detail here
Okay.
that whatever touched these offerings would become holy,
Interesting.
suggesting this kind of transfer.
So it's almost like holiness was contagious?
Almost like holiness was contagious. Yeah.
In this context,
Yeah.
were there any special kinds of grain offerings?
Yes.
There was.
For particular events.
The text describes a specific offering for the day the high priest was anointed.
Okay.
So on that day, Aaron and his sons
Uh-huh.
were to bring a tenth of an ephah
Okay.
of the finest flour as a regular grain offering.
Okay.
Half in the morning and half in the evening.
Now, an ephah was a dry measure roughly equivalent to about half a bushel.
Okay.
So a tenth of that was still a significant amount of flour.
It sounds like a lot of flour for daily offering, right?
And the way it was prepared was also detailed. It
Okay.
had to be mixed with oil,
Right.
cooked on a griddle,
Okay.
mixed, and then broken into pieces
Okay.
before being presented as an aroma pleasing to the Lord.
Right, right.
This offering was also perpetual for any high priest who succeeded Aaron.
Okay.
And it had a specific requirement.
Okay.
It was to be burned completely on the altar.
So different treatment for the high priest's grain offering
Different treatment there?
than for the other ones.
Yeah, for the other one.
Yeah, okay. And the section on green offerings concludes with a clear rule
It does.
that every green offering made by a priest himself
Mm-hmm.
had to be burned completely and not eaten. So this distinguishes it from the portions of other grain offerings that the priests were allowed to consume.
That's correct.
Okay, so different rules for different people.
Different rules for different people, yeah.
And different contexts.
Different contexts.
All right, let's move on to the sin offering.
Okay.
How did that one work?
So the sin offering also had a very specific procedure.
Okay.
And it was slaughtered before the Lord
Yeah.
in the same place
Uh-huh.
where the burnt offering was slaughtered,
So the location in the slaughter
emphasizing this most holy status.
was significant.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the priest who offered the sin offering
Right.
was the one who would eat it.
Okay.
And again, this had to happen
Right.
in the sanctuary area,
Okay.
in the courtyard of the tent of meeting.
Right.
This idea of the priest consuming part of the offering
Right.
seems to be a really important aspect of these rituals, perhaps symbolizing their role as intermediaries or their participation in the act of atonement.
It's almost like by eating it,
Yes.
they are somehow taking on or dealing with the sin on
Yes.
behalf of the community.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, okay.
And similar to the grain offering,
Right.
the text mentions that anything that touched the flesh
Okay.
of the sin offering would become holy.
Okay.
There's also a practical detail here. If any of the blood
Okay.
from the sin offering splattered on a garment,
Right.
that garment had to be washed in the sanctuary area.
Okay.
Again, highlighting the sacred nature.
So even the cleaning
Bonnie,
had
take
to
that.
happen in a sacred place.
Yes.
Okay.
And the text goes on to describe how to handle the pot.
Okay.
The offering was cooked in half.
Right.
If the meat was cooked in a clay pot,
Uh-huh.
the pot had to be broken afterward.
Okay.
However, if it was cooked in a bronze pot,
Right.
it had to be scoured and rinsed with water,
Interesting.
suggesting different methods of purification,
So depending on the material
depending on the material of the vessel
of the pot.
of the pot. That's right.
Yeah.
And who was allowed to eat the sin offering?
Okay. Yeah. Who could eat this?
Any male member of a priest's family could eat it,
Okay.
as it was considered most holy. However, there's a very important exception to this rule.
Oh, okay. So there's a condition.
Yes.
Yeah.
The text states that any sin offering whose blood was brought into the tent of meeting or atonement in the holy place
Mm-hmm.
was not to be eaten.
Okay.
It had to be completely burned up.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the specific steps
Yes.
for making restitution when you've wronged someone.
That's right.
We've talked about the continuous flame
Right.
of the burnt offering
The burnt offering.
and the shared meal aspect
Yeah.
of the grain offering
Of the grain offering
and all the particular rules
and the very specific rules
surrounding the sin offering,
surrounding the sin offering
including when it could be eaten
and when it had to be
and when it had to be totally burned up.
completely burned up. And when we look at all of this together, some really important principles emerge.
Yeah. What do you see?
Well, there's this strong emphasis on taking concrete action
Right.
to make things right.
It's not just about feeling sorry.
When you've harmed someone,
Yeah.
it's not just about an internal feeling of regret.
Right.
There are very specific, tangible steps.
Right. Taking action.
Yeah.
And that requirement to add that extra fifth of the value
Right.
to the restitution,
Yeah.
I think really highlights
It really highlights
how serious
the
this
seriousness of dishonesty
Yeah.
and the need to not just repair the damage,
Yes.
but to go a step further
To go a step further.
and provide a deterrent.
Yeah. To really make it clear that this is not okay.
Right.
And then you have all these detailed procedures for each type of offering,
Right.
each with its own purpose.
Right, and its own set of rules.
And its own set of rules,
Right.
representing different aspects of devotion atonement.
And even provision for those serving in the priesthood.
Right, right. And what might strike you, the listener,
Yeah.
is just how specific and detailed both the ethical breaches
Right.
and the ways of addressing them were.
Yeah, prescribed ways of addressing them.
Right. It wasn't
It wasn't abstract.
abstract.
It wasn't vague.
Yeah, it was
It was about concrete actions
concrete action
and offering.
and offerings.
It really makes you think about how societies handle similar issues
Yeah.
of accountability
Yeah.
and expressions of remorse or devotion.
Right.
You know, we have legal systems and different ways of apologizing.
Right. But the directness and the ritualized nature of these ancient instructions.
It's pretty remarkable.
It really is.
It makes you think about how they saw the connection between an offense
Right.
and then making amends
Make amends.
in a very real way.
And then also seeking forgiveness through this ritual practice.
Yeah.
So, considering these ancient instructions, what fundamental ideas about justice,
Yeah.
responsibility,
Responsibility.
the relationship between an individual
And something greater than themselves.
and a higher power or something like that
Yeah.
might still hold some resonance for us today.
Even though the ways that we practice these things are so different.
These things are completely different.
Yeah.
It's something to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
It raises this important question
Yeah.
about the enduring human need for accountability,
Right.
for finding ways to repair harm,
Right.
and for connecting with something beyond our individual selves,
Right.
even across thousands of years
Right.
and vastly different cultural expressions.
That's fascinating. And it's definitely something we can think about today.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us.